מסתכלים בו בשתיקה, אנשים מקצה הזמן, מקצה האור והחיים, בבגדים עבים, בצעדים כבדים, שום דבר לא היה כמו ההבטחות, הבטיחו ארץ חמה.
Welcome to day 12 of our 14 days of awesome films. This afternoon, we are meeting with Professor Eran Kaplan, who will delve into the excellent documentary Ma'abarot. The film is underwritten by Lily and David Naveh, Martha Ann and Sandy Wishnev, and is co-sponsored by Temple Isaiah. My name is Efi Lubliner, and as a board member of the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival, I welcome you to this bonus event. Although we are approaching our closing day of the festival, we still have several excellent films to share with you. Tomorrow, The Dead of Jaffa starts its 3-day streaming. It's a riveting drama about the mixed city before, during, and after the War of Independence. On Friday, we have two must-see films: the Italian drama Thou Shall Not Hate and the Israeli light drama Golden Voices. You do not want to miss either one. Also on Friday at 4 p.m., Professor Kaplan, you are about to meet him, will talk on The Dead of Jaffa, placing the film into its historic context. And now, Eran Kaplan. So, Eran Kaplan is a Rhoda and Richard Goldman Chair in Israeli Studies at San Francisco State University. He received his BA magna cum laude from Tel Aviv University and his PhD in modern Jewish history from Brandeis University. Before coming to San Francisco, he taught at Princeton, Cincinnati, and Toronto. Eran is also an author of several books: The Jewish Radical Right, The Origins of Israel, and his latest, Projecting the Nation, History and Ideology on the Israeli Screen. In addition, he has written for Haaretz, the Israeli daily newspaper. At SFSU, Professor Kaplan teaches courses on modern Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli cinema, modern Hebrew culture, and on the history of Jerusalem. It's with great pleasure that I now introduce to you Shalom Eran Kaplan.
Shalom Efi. Thank you so much for this introduction. And again, I want to thank the board for inviting me here to speak to you today. Over the past more than a year, I think the movies have really provided an outlet for all of us. And being able to participate in a festival on Zoom, not in person, is still such a thrill and a joy during this time. So again, thank you so much. So I'm going to speak to you today about the Ma'abara or the Ma'abarot, which were, the word Ma'abara comes to us from the Hebrew la'avor, to transit, to move forward. And these were camps and areas where new immigrants lived in Israel during mainly the 1950s. But before I get into the details, I just want to tell you, the last Ma'abarot, the last camps were closed in 1963. But in the Israeli collective consciousness, the Ma'abarot continue to live until this very day. And the long-standing divide between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim in Israeli society, between Jews who came originally from European countries and Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries. And some of the most difficult social, political, and cultural questions in Israel today still relate and go back to the experience of new immigrants in the Ma'abarot. If you look at some of the most recent films that come out of Israel, many of them, like the documentary Ma'abarot, but others, deal with the legacy of the absorption of immigrants in Israel in the 1950s. If you read some of the poetry produced in Israel in recent years much of it by young Mizrahi poets. There are constant references to the experience of their parents and grandparents in those ma'abarot. So this is something that is still very much alive in Israel today. So it is really worthwhile revisiting and trying to understand the historical context, which to a large degree sheds light on important things that are still going on in Israel today. So before I get to the ma'abarot themselves, something about immigration to Palestine and then to Israel by way of background. So of course, starting in the 1880s, with the rise of the Zionist movement, Jewish migration or aliyah to the land of Israel, Palestine, later Israel, grew dramatically, and the size of the Jewish community in Palestine increased. This would intensify once the British gained control over Palestine and created the mandate over Palestine. However, already in 1920, they set parameters for immigration policy regarding Jews arriving in Palestine. And this was designed by Lord Churchill, who was then the Minister of Colonies in the British government. And he basically said that Jewish immigration to Palestine will be dependent on the economic ability of the land to absorb new immigrants. Initially, this basically meant nothing. And throughout the 1920s, any Jew who wanted to migrate to Palestine was basically welcome and could do it. However, as tensions between Jews and Arabs escalated starting in 1929, the British would begin to publish a series of what came to be known as white books, which would begin to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. It started in 1930, a most inopportune time, considering what will happen in Europe soon. And it would become even stricter in early 1939, where the British basically restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 people a year. We, of course, know what started in Europe later that year, the Second World War. And so for Jews hoping to escape Europe and trying to find a safe haven, and remember, most countries around the world refused to accept Jewish refugees at that time, it meant that Palestine was not a viable option because the British were very strict in enforcing those limits on Jewish immigration to Palestine. And so, of course, 6 million Jews perished during the Holocaust. And in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there were still hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, of Jews who were refugees, who were in displaced persons camps in Europe, trying again to find a safe haven. But they were unable, the majority of them, to immigrate, to make aliyah to Palestine because of the restrictive British policies. And this is going to be crucial because of what will happen starting in 1948. As a result, the growth of the Jewish community in Palestine was stunted starting in 1939 and was able to grow very, very slowly. And so by the time the British mandate would come to an end in 1948, there were about 600,000 Jews in Palestine and what would become, starting on May 15th, 1948, the State of Israel. Now, on the night between May 14th, May 15th, 1948, Israel declared independence, and David Ben-Gurion in Tel Aviv read the Declaration of Independence. And I would like to show you one sentence from that declaration that's going to be relevant to our story right here. And it says, as you can see, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. So this was the declaration by the state. And as soon as a ceasefire came into effect in June of 1948, remember, the state of Israel was born in the midst of a war, and the day after the creation of the state, 7 Arab armies invaded the state of Israel. But 3 weeks after that, there was a ceasefire negotiated by the UN. And during the ceasefire, the gates were open and immigrants came to Israel, and in very large numbers. The first wave of immigrants that would come to Israel came from those displaced persons camps in Europe and from places where the British exiled people who tried to immigrate illegally into Palestine before May of 1948. So these were primarily Eastern European Jews who ended up in camps after the Second World War, and those who were unable to go to other places. And we have to say that many of them did not want to come to Israel in 1948. Many of them wanted to come to North America. For many of them, this was the preferable destination. Not all of them could, but those who could went to the United States. For others, whether they did it for ideological reasons, because of their Zionist longings, or because they had no other choice, Israel became their preferred destination. And so tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews arrived in Israel in 1948 and early 1949. But by around 1949, 1950, the potential for Jews of European origin to immigrate to Israel pretty much exhausted itself by this point. There were no reserves of Jews looking for the opportunity to immigrate. Because those who were in what now became communist countries, in many cases, could not leave those countries because of restrictions imposed by the governments there, especially in the Soviet Union. And Jews in the West were not all that enthusiastic or eager to move to Israel at that point. So there were very small numbers of Jews who came from North America, for example, and immigrated to Israel in those years. And so this first wave of migration came to an end. But starting in 1949, we see the next major wave of Jewish migration into Israel. And this time, most of those Jews will come from Arab and Muslim countries. And the term that we use today to describe Jews who come from that part of the world are Mizrachim. And here we're talking about, again, most historians today divide this wave of migration into 2 phases. The first phase took place in 1949 and early 1950, and it brought Jews from 3 countries, Yemen, Iraq, and Libya. In those cases, the Jews living in those countries faced hostilities by the local population as a result mainly of the 1948 war and the tensions between Jews and Arabs in Israel, Palestine, and they felt pressure, threatened. And those areas which were still under the control of the British at that time, Israel negotiated with the British and local authorities to have the Jewish population from those countries come to Israel. So this was the first major wave of migration from Arab and Muslim countries into Israel. Once that organized phase ended, we will see ongoing waves of migration, mainly from North Africa. Morocco, especially, which was the largest Jewish community in the Arab world, and other parts of North Africa, and from other countries in the region as well. Now, I read to you the part from the Declaration of Independence that called for the state to absorb immigrants. One of the first major laws that the Israeli Knesset parliament passed in 1950 was the law of return, which regulated immigration and naturalization in Israel. And let's look at this law because, again, there is a part there that's going to be relevant to our discussion later on. So I'm going to share the screen with you again and read to you the Law of Return from 1950. Later on, there were some amendments made, but it says that every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole. Aliyah shall be by ole's visa. An ole visa shall be granted to every Jew who has expressed his desire to settle in Israel, unless the Minister of Immigration is satisfied that the applicant is either engaged in an activity directed against the Jewish people or is likely to endanger public health or the security of the state. So let's keep in mind this issue of public health. It's going to play a role as we move forward in our discussion. And so, just to get the broad picture, a country of 600,000 people is now absorbing major waves of migration. In its first decade, from 1948 to 1958, Israel absorbed 900,000 immigrants. So the population grew by 150% over that period. So I know that the absolute numbers perhaps are not all that spectacular, but think of any country that faces the challenge of absorbing 150% of its population as immigrants over a period of 10 years. I think we can all agree that this is quite an endeavor. And when such large amount of people arrive, you need to provide the basic services. And number one, you need to house them. And there were simply not enough places to house these people. Now, the first immigrants who arrived, the first wave of 1948, 1949, the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, it was much easier initially to absorb them. Many of them had relatives or contacts already established in Israel. The majority of the population of Israel consisted of Eastern European Jews who started arriving in the 1880s into Palestine. When the Holocaust survivors and others arrived in 1948, 1949, they had relatives, friends, connections that really helped them initially. The second, as the historian Tom Segev told us in his book, The First Israelis from 1949, is that there were many abandoned Arab houses in Israel as a result of the 1948 war, and many of the immigrants who arrived in 1948, early 1949, were housed in some of those abandoned Arab houses. But by 1950, there were no empty houses. There were really no place to absorb. So what started happening is that initially, the state built immigration camps, basically cities of tents that covered large swaths of the country to absorb the immigrants that were coming in. And the idea was that this would be only a temporary solution until they can be absorbed. And while they were in those machanot olim, immigrant camps, the state took full responsibility and provided for them. The immigrants initially were not expected to work yet, so they were given food and shelter and medicine and other services in those tents. However, it was obvious that the state would not be able to sustain that for an extended period of time. So they decided to move from the model of those absorption camps to what came to be known as the ma'abara, which indicates a transitional period, whereby the state will build areas or towns or camps that will transition from tents into sheds or quasi-permanent housing. And during that time, the immigrants will start learning the language if they don't speak Hebrew, and they will start working and supporting themselves. they will also have to start sending the children to schools, meaning the idea was that while they were in the ma'abara, they will begin to integrate into Israeli society in order for them to become, hopefully as soon as possible, productive members of society and no longer just simply rely on the state to support them. And this was the idea behind the ma'abara. By the end of 1951, the population of the ma'abarot reached its peak. It was 256,000. People lived in those quasi-camps, semi-villages, early towns. And the ethnic makeup within the ma'abarot was that about 80% of them were Mizrahim, meaning Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries. So they were the overwhelming majority of the people living in those camps. So the peak was reached in 1951, and since then we see a gradual decline over the years. And by 1963, the last ma'abarot were closed down, and that was the end of this chapter. Now, we need to ask two fundamental questions. Why did the government pursue this policy, which created very harsh conditions? And just to give you a taste of the conditions and what life is there, I'm going to be using one of the most iconic Israeli films ever produced. It's the movie Salach Shabati by Ephraim Kishon from 1964, which is really a story of this wave of immigration into Israel. It follows Salach Shabati, the patriarch of a Jewish family that arrives from somewhere in the Middle East, doesn't exactly tell us. And they spend time in the Ma'abara, in this transitory camp. So here we get a glimpse of what life is like. And here we see Topol, who plays Salach Shabati. He's in this shack in the Ma'abara. And let's see what happens, kind of the experience through his eyes. So I'm going to enter full screen, and here he sits while it's raining outside.
מה יש, סלח?
אני לא אוהב את המדריך הזה מהקיבוץ, הוא מסובב לחבובה את הראש שלו.
חבובה בחורה טובה.
אני אמרתי שהיא רעה, אבל אני רוצה שבערב היא תהיה בבית.
בבית? איפה יש פה בית? איפה?
האישה.
זה בית זה? לא עושה כל היום שום דבר, כי יושב בפוטל שלו כמו המלך, ואומר בית, אומר.
יא אישה, אל תתחילי איתי, תני חלב לפולה שלך ותשתקי,
שיש, כל...
So here we see these harsh conditions under which the Shabbati family lives, and I need to stop it on my end, yes. And for many in Israel at that time, they were aware of the harsh conditions in those transitory camps. For example, this scene that Kishon captures of the rain. 1950, Effie probably doesn't remember because he was too young, was the harshest recorded winter in Israel. Tel Aviv was covered in snow in 1950. And the conditions in those camps and the places like Salahliv were horrific. And the newly created Israeli journal, Ha'olam Hazeh, did an investigative report about the horrific conditions in those ma'abarot, and detailed instances where people died because of the physical conditions during that winter. So there was public outrage about what was going on in those camps. So the public was aware of those conditions, and this led to pressure on the government. And the politics over the ma'abarot heated again in 1951, because once the government requested that the families in the ma'abarot send their kids to schools, there was a debate what schools to send them to, whether secular schools or religious schools. And this led to the collapse of the first Israeli government in 1951, the coalition, over the question of what schools to send the children of the ma'abarot. And when a new government came into power, they legislated a law that regulated the different streams of public education in Israel. So this was also a reaction to a crisis that emerged in those ma'abarot, in the camps. But my point is that people were aware of the harsh and difficult conditions and the social challenges in real time, which begs the question again, why did the government pursue those policies? And here we really have two explanations, two general explanations. One is the economic reality in Israel at the time. So we have to understand, and we have to take those things into consideration. The state of Israel was born into a war that started in 1947 and ended in 1949. This war exhausted basically all the economic resources of the young state of Israel. Israel was bankrupt by 1949. It used whatever capital it accumulated in the years leading up to 1948 in order to fight the war, to purchase weapons, and to fight it and to support the population while the war was going on. As you probably know, Israel is not very rich in natural resources. I know that natural gas was discovered in the Mediterranean, but back then nobody knew about those fields in the sea. And while there are some minerals and salts in the Dead Sea, unlike other countries in the region, Israel couldn't simply dig into the ground and find oil to support itself. Think of the Middle East as a donut, donut that you fry in oil. So there's lots of oil throughout this donut, but every donut has a hole. The hole is Israel, where there's absolutely no oil in the ground. So there was no immediate economic relief in Israel. And economic relief would only start really in 1952 with the reparations agreement that Israel signed with West Germany. So in this harsh economic reality, when there were no resources, the government really, I don't know if there was any other alternative than the most basic, rudimentary, and not sufficient means to support the immigrants. So we also have to understand the type of economic reality that existed at the time. But this is only part of the explanation and part of the issue. The other thing that we need to delve into, to explore in greater detail, is the social and cultural tensions that emerged in those years between the veteran Ashkenazi establishment and the Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries. And for this, we need to consider the fact that the Jewish community in Palestine, Israel, 1948, was incredibly homogeneous. The overwhelming majority came from a small area in Europe. We're talking the western edge of Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. Basically, that was the area that they all came from. So their social networks, their cultural heritage, gave them a sense of an identity, something that was entirely foreign among Jews who grew up and were born in Arab and Muslim countries. And when the Jewish immigration from Europe exhausted itself, and it was seen that the only potential for immigrants was from Arab and Muslim countries, it created tensions within the political establishment in Israel. And at this point, I would like to share with you a few quotes by Israeli officials from those years regarding the potential immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries. This is collected, as I mentioned before, in Tom Segev's book, 1949, The First Israelis. So I will just share with you a few quotes, which I think are quite telling. So here it goes. This will affect all aspects of life in the country, the Foreign Office warned its diplomats. Its conclusion was that the preservation of the country's cultural level demands a flow of immigration from the West, and not only from the backward Levantine countries. You are familiar with the immigrants from those places, said Shoshana Persitz, member of Knesset. You know that we do not have a common language with them. Our cultural level is not theirs. Their way of life is medieval. And Yosef Weitz, another Israeli official at the time, said, while I was talking with Yosef Shprintzak, who was the Speaker of the Knesset, he expressed anxiety about preserving our cultural standards, given the massive immigration from the Orient. There are indeed grounds for anxiety, but what's the use? Can we stop it? And Yaakov Zubavel, head of the Middle East Department of the Jewish Agency, concurred. Perhaps these are not the Jews we would like to see coming here, but we can hardly tell them not to come. And later on, he quotes Ben Gurion, who said the following, Europe's Jewry, wrote Ben Gurion, shaped the entire Jewish people throughout the world, whereas the Islamic countries have in the past few hundred years played passive role in the history of the nation. He stated that Zionism was largely a movement of Western Jews, specifically those of Europe and America. He illustrated this point by comparing income and so on and so forth. Then he said, Hitler, more than he hurt the Jewish people whom he knew he detested, hurt the Jewish state, whose coming he did not foresee. He destroyed the substance, the main and essential building force of the state. The state arose and did not find the nation which had waited for it. So I think we can understand the type of sentiment that existed. And these are all quotes that appeared either in newspapers or statements made by government officials and the prime minister. So this was not said behind closed doors. This became part of the public discourse. And this, of course, raises the question of whether the government felt that perhaps it was not required to treat immigrants who came from Arab and Muslim countries in the same manner that it would treat the more preferable immigrants who could have come from Europe to build the new state. And here I would like to show you the opening of the movie Salah Shabati, again from 1964, which I think really captures this type of attitude and view of the cultural difference between European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahim. So I will share my screen with you again. And this is really the opening of the movie Salah Shabati.
תיירים או עולים?
חצי חצי.
נו, זה יהיה יום.
The bags. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. Mama, where's 6? Where are the bags? Hier, zie je, maar dat kan ik vinden. Wie is het? Wie is het? Hier. 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
שהחיינו וקימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. אמן. מזל!
As you can clearly see, the Ashkenazi family speaking Yiddish on the way down from the plane, they're counting suitcases dressed in European garb. Salah and his family dressed in Oriental garb. He's counting children, and one of them is missing, so she comes out on the conveyor belt, and the entire movie repeats those stereotypes between the cultivated, educated Ashkenazim and the primitive Mizrahim. And there was a growing sentiment among the dwellers of the Ma'abarot, and then later on, that the fact that those immigrants were forced into those camps, were forced into a situation where they would enjoy at best second-rate education, if at all, and that they were forced into the type of organized state-sponsored labor, forestation, road building, which would send them into a cycle of poverty. So the lowest paying jobs available that will not prepare them to integrate into a more advanced economy. And the argument has been going on since the 1950s and intensified in recent years. And in many ways, the film Ma'abarot is a reflection of this ongoing debate, is that by sending the immigrants into those Ma'abarot and not investing from the very beginning in education, in professional training, in truly integrating them into Israeli society, fundamental socio-economic gaps were created, such that would continue to define Israel until this very day. Now, told you that officially Ma'abarot came to an end by 1963. But in many ways, they never did come to an end. Because, again, the government still needed a solution. What do you do? And the solution came with what came to be known as Ayarot Pituach, development towns. So towns were built in order to absorb the dwellers of the Ma'abarot. And these were basically housing projects that were built on Israel's borders in the north and in the south, not far from the Gaza Strip or not far from the Lebanese border. And so the residents of the Ma'abarot, the overwhelming majority of them Jews who came from North Africa, were sent to those development towns, which at least initially looked very promising. These were new buildings, but within a few years turned into slums. And so the mechanism of the Ma'abara continued in those development towns, in some cases until today, until this very day. Therefore, many critical sociologists, cultural activists are claiming that the Ma'abara is not something that's part of the past, but it is still the present, the ongoing present in Israel, which perpetuates the dividing lines between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, between the veterans and the newcomers, between what came to be known in Israel in the 1960s, the Israel HaRishonah, the first Israel, and Israel HaShniya, the second Israel. And so understanding the place of the Ma'abara, understanding the trauma of immigration, understanding the role of immigration in creating the state, and the various social, economic, and political issues that arose as a result of the Ma'abarot is, I think, still crucial to understand political developments in Israel today. And you can still, now Israel has elections every 3-4 months, you can still see certain political currents in Israel, certain blocs who vote to certain parties or certain ways as a legacy of the issues that were created in the 1950s. And so I will conclude my remarks here, and I'm happy to continue the conversation by answering questions.
So I guess I can ask some questions that we got while you were lecturing. Thank you very, very, very much. Greatly appreciate the information. It's really amazing since I was born in 49. Obviously, I didn't know about the snowstorm of 1950, but I did know about the Ma'abarot. I remember that quite well when I was a young man. A couple of questions here that we got. And the first one came from Greg, and he's saying, there is a kibbutz Ma'abarot near Tzomet Bet Lid. Bet Lid was mentioned in the film. Is that kibbutz related to these transit camps and the origin of its name?
I don't think so, but the kibbutzim played a crucial role with the Ma'abarot because many Ma'abarot were built next to kibbutzim. And you can see it clearly in the movie Salah Shabati, where there's a whole dynamic between the kibbutz and the Ma'abara next to it. And some kibbutzim tried to aid the Ma'abarot and help them. However, there was a claim later on that the kibbutzim used the dwellers of the Ma'abarot as cheap labor to help the kibbutzim and exploited them. So it goes in kind of complicated ways as well, this legacy.
The love story is between a kibbutznik and a Ma'abara girl.
Of course, yes. But that's a comedy.
Another question comes, is there been an evolvement of the way Israel treated Olim, new immigrants, especially when it comes to the 90s with the major immigration from Russia?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, did they learn the lesson, and the following immigration waves were treated in a different manner?
Yes. So I will say two things. Israel of the 1990s is not Israel of the 1950s. Israel by the 1990s is an economic powerhouse and has far more resources to deal with immigration, which was still a major challenge. We're talking about 1 million immigrants roughly that arrived in the 1990s, and it was not an easy transition. But there was a major difference in overall ideological attitude towards immigrants between the 1950s and 1990s. In the 1950s, the idea was of a melting pot. The dominant ideology was of a melting pot, and the expectation was that the immigrants would become Israelis, that they will shed their exilic identity, their past, and be reborn as Israelis, learn the language, become Israeli, and leave the past behind. But the 1990s, Israel is much more of a multicultural society. And there was really no expectation that the immigrants would abandon their heritage behind and become Israelis. And you can see that many of the immigrants in the 1990s, in some cases, didn't even make an effort to integrate culturally and socially into the country. So in this regard, it was quite different. But we can look at the immigration from Ethiopia. So that started in the 1980s. And here we see that some of the legacies of the 1950s did reproduce themselves in the manner that they were treated and absorbed. And some of the hostility that the immigrants faced in the 1950s, we saw it again in the way some of those immigrants from Ethiopia were treated in Israel, in some cases until this very day. So yes, some things repeated themselves, other things evolved and changed over time.
The question comes out asking, has intermarriage lowered the cultural barrier over the decades?
So this was the message of the movie Salach Shabati. Two of Salach's children marry people from the kibbutz, Ashkenazim from the kibbutz. And the idea was that within 2-3 generations, this will be erased. And this was the assumption, I think, for many years. But what is still fascinating about Israeli society and culture today, that it hasn't. It still reverberates. It is still such a crucial element in every aspect of Israel today. So if you read Israeli poetry as an example, it is front and center. In Israeli cinema, it is still front and center. If you turn on the television in Israel today and you watch the news on Channel 13, the most popular commentator, Avishai Ben Chaim, constantly speaks about the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide, rehashing the arguments against the Israeli establishment of the 1950s. So it is still an open wound that does not seem to disappear.
And they ask, and I will add to it, why? I do not understand that. Years have passed, economic situation changed.
Yes.
To go back to the 50s and say, okay, yes, for various reasons, I really believe, I always believed that it was all mostly money, not bad will, but I may be wrong. I may be totally wrong, but as growing up in Israel was always the idea, yes, absorption, yes, absolutely. And I didn't see it as treating them badly at all. I mean, when we played soccer in the streets, it didn't matter whether you were Ashkenazi or Sephardi.
Yes, but when you got drafted into the army at the age of 18, you know that you were given a psychological profile, and it determined, for example, your ability to go to officers training, your Kabba. For Mizrahim, we now know, information was released a few months ago, 2 points were deducted if your parents came from an Arab and Muslim country. Yes.
Wow,
when it came to sending kids to high schools, we know that there were academic high schools, Iyuniyim, and vocational high schools, Mikzoyim. In the academic high schools, 90% of the students were Ashkenazi. In the vocational high schools, 90% of the students were Mizrahi. So,
can you point the finger as to what caused it?
Again, I think that there's a host of issues. One, the group that created the society and the culture that will become the state of Israel were Ashkenazi Jews. And they created a certain culture, a certain system, which was very much kind of a European model set in the Middle East. And they came with academic degrees, or they went to the newly created universities in Israel, and they were ready to compete in this environment. The immigrants who came from Arab and Muslim countries, by and large, did not possess these, not abilities, but they didn't have the necessary background to immediately integrate into this society. Very different from the immigrants who came from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. Many of them were scientists, technicians, that had the type of education that would allow them to integrate fairly easily into Israeli society. So the gap was already there. And so if you came without any training, without any advanced education, it was very easy to send you to forestation, building roads, into kind of dead-end, low-paying jobs. So in a way, it was a cycle that repeated itself. And there was, as Tom Segev and others indicate, this very negative attitude towards those immigrants. So I think that there was a variety of factors that contributed to those gaps. And the wounds are still there in Israel today, as we can see it.
A person is asking, is it accurate to say that majority of Mizrahi Jews are usually voting for Likud?
So, yes. And it certainly started in the 1970s. The big shift in Israeli politics that took place in the 1970s and brought the Likud into power was the shift in the Mizrahi vote. In the 50s and 60s, they tended to vote for Labor, which was the party in power and provided the jobs and the housing. But the second generation in the 1970s turned radically against Labor and shifted and voted for Likud. And since then, absolutely, the majority of Likud voters in Israel are Mizrahim, though in recent years, more and more vote for Shas and other parties, which explains why the Likud has shrunk in overall numbers in recent years. But this is absolutely true, yes.
Let me see if I can glance at some of the other questions. Are the Mizrahi Jews more traditional than the Ashkenazim?
So, yes. So the term that has been used to describe them is Masorti, which is kind of a uniquely Israeli designation. We shouldn't confuse it with conservative Judaism in the United States. Completely different. So what happened with European Jews in the 19th century is that really it went in two opposing ways. One, secularization. So the emergence of secular Jewish identity in Eastern Europe. If we read Bialik, right, how he rejects the cheder and the religious teachings of his father and becomes a secular Jew. On the other hand, we have the rise of ultra-Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, where the religious Jews become actually more radicalized as a reaction to modernity and its challenges. In the Arab and Muslim world, we didn't have those processes. There was no secularization in large extent. There was some in the biggest cities, but nothing like what the Jews experienced in Europe. And there was no ultra-Orthodoxy either. So from an Ashkenazi perspective, they were seen as Masortiim. Religion was an important part of their life and their tradition, but it was never the radical interpretation of ultra-Orthodoxy, nor was it the secular way of life. And this really created a cultural clash. If you read the wonderful novel Tanegol Kaparot, which tells the story of a young immigrant from Iraq to Israel, and when he's confronted by the secular way of life in the kibbutz, it's a culture shock. And he's not ultra-Orthodox. He's not all that devout or religious. But still, this modern secular way of life was for them a traumatic experience. So yes, yeah.
And that might explain why those places, even though they were adjacent to kibbutzim in many cases, were really not integrated into the kibbutz, which is a question: why wasn't there a policy, a government policy, to integrate them into the kibbutzim, thus getting them much easier, safer transition?
Because the kibbutzim, by and large, didn't want to absorb them. They wanted to maintain their own privileges at the time.
And I think I have one last question, and it's very, very interesting to me too, because I didn't think about it. Those 1.6 mil that you mentioned that came between 50 to 63 into the huge influx of from 600,000 to 150% more. Were any of them informed in advance what to expect upon arrival in Israel?
Not really, because again, the first wave was basically organized immigration. They were forced out of Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, where the local authorities with the British wanted to get rid of the Jewish population, and the Jews wanted out because they were facing real threats. So they were just brought in, put on planes, and brought into Israel. No questions asked. Later on, again, they were not fully prepared for the experience of coming to Israel, even later on.
I think that's about the end of it. I think that we've heard a lot, we've learned a lot there, and it was absolutely an eye-opener for me too. I know a lot of it, but I didn't know most of it. It's news to me too, so I really, really enjoyed the lecture and learning from you. I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure that our audience has enjoyed it as well. And if they didn't do it right now live, they will be able to do it on, it's recorded. So people will be able in the next few days to come back and watch this interview. And more important, even than the interview, with all due respect, is watch the movie. It's really, really, really very well done. And the footage is incredible. The footage in this movie, I don't know where they found all this footage, but it's incredible what they were able to find about the Ma'abarot and how they were created. And it really gives you a feel for the period. It really, really does. Thanks a lot, everyone. Watch more movies. Love the movies. Eat your popcorn at home. Stay safe, and we will see you soon. And Eran, we will see you back on Friday. Shalom.
Hello.